The screaming alarms of the TSS Prometheus cut through space like a death cry as Commander Sarah Chen fought desperately with the ship's failing controls. Red warning lights bathed the bridge in an ominous glow while her fingers danced across holographic displays that flickered and died one by one. Mayday, Mayday, this is TSS Prometheus requesting immediate assistance. Sarah spoke into her comm unit, though she knew the chances of anyone hearing her transmission in this remote sector were practically zero. The ship lurched violently to starboard, throwing her against the navigation console hard enough to leave bruises she wouldn't live to see heal. Through the main view screen, the planet Drakmor loomed like a jewel of death. Its surface was a tapestry of impossible beauty. Crystalline mountains that caught and refracted the light of twin suns, valleys of liquid gold that flowed like rivers, and forests of what appeared to be living metal trees that swayed without wind. It was also one of the most forbidden worlds in known space. The Galactic Council had placed Drakmor under absolute quarantine 3,000 years ago, after the Dragon Wars had ended and the mysterious disappearance of the Dragon Lords had left questions that still haunted every spacefaring civilization. No ship was permitted within 5 light years of the system. The automated defense satellites that surrounded the planet didn't ask questions. They simply destroyed anything that came too close. Sarah had been fleeing from a Vorthan battlecruiser when she'd been forced to make the jump to hyperspace with a damaged navigation computer. She'd hoped to lose her pursuers in the uncharted regions beyond the galactic rim. Instead, she dropped out of hyperspace directly into Drakmor's gravity well, and the ancient defense systems had immediately begun targeting her ship. "Hull breach on decks 4 through 7, the computer's synthetic voice announced with infuriating calm. "Life support failing. Estimated time until total system failure, 7 minutes, 32 seconds. Sarah cursed under her breath in 3 different languages as she redirected all available power to the engines. The Prometheus had been a good ship, a reliable scout vessel that had carried her safely through dozens of dangerous missions for the Terran fleet. Now it was dying around her, its superstructure groaning as atmospheric pressure tore pieces of the hull away into the void. The planet's surface rushed up to meet her with terrifying speed. She could see individual mountain peaks now, towering spires of what looked like solid diamond that rose kilometers into the thin atmosphere. Between them, vast canyons glowed with internal light, as if the planet's very core was trying to escape through cracks in its crystalline skin. "Computer, initiate emergency landing procedures," Sarah commanded, strapping herself into the pilot's seat with practiced efficiency. "Target those flat areas between the crystal formations. Warning: atmospheric analysis indicates high levels of exotic radiation. Survival probability on planetary surface calculated at 12%. Recommend immediate evacuation via escape pod." "The escape pods were destroyed by the defense satellites," Sarah reminded the computer grimly. "It's crash landing or nothing." She pulled back on the flight controls, trying to angle the ship's descent to avoid the worst of the crystal spires that jutted up from the planet's surface like the teeth of some impossibly huge predator. The atmospheric entry was brutal. The ship bucked and rolled as superheated gases tore away the remaining hull plating, and several more systems failed in showers of sparks. The impact, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. The Prometheus skidded across what appeared to be a plain of polished obsidian, its remaining engines carving furrows in the dark stone before the ship finally came to rest in the shadow of a mountain that rose like a cathedral of pale green crystal. Sarah remained conscious just long enough to activate the ship's emergency beacon and grab her survival pack before the combination of smoke inhalation and a concussion from the crash sent her into darkness. She woke to the sound of wind chimes. The soft, musical tinkling seemed to come from everywhere at once, a gentle melody that spoke of peace and safety, in ways that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some deep, primitive part of her brain. Sarah's eyes opened, slowly, expecting to see the familiar confines of the ship's emergency medical bay. Instead, she found herself lying on a bed of what looked like woven starlight. The material was soft and warm, with an opalescent sheen that shifted colors as she moved. Above her, the ceiling was open to a sky the color of amethyst, where twin suns cast everything in a warm, golden glow. Sarah sat up carefully, her body protesting with a dozen different aches and pains. Her survival pack lay nearby, apparently untouched, but she was no longer wearing her scorched and torn uniform. Instead, someone had dressed her in a simple robe made of the same strange material as the bedding, comfortable, perfectly fitted, and completely alien. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. The answer came not in words, but in a soft chirping sound from somewhere behind her. Sarah turned slowly, not wanting to aggravate what felt like a significant head injury, and found herself face to face with the impossible. A baby dragon lay curled in a nest of the same starlight material, no larger than a house cat. Its scales were the deep blue-black of space between stars, but they caught the light in ways that created tiny galaxies of color across its small form. Its eyes were ancient and intelligent, far too knowing for something so young, and they were fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're not supposed to exist," Sarah said softly, remembering her xenobiology training. "Dragons went extinct 3,000 years ago. The baby dragon made a sound that was part purr, part musical trill, and part something entirely alien." It rose to its feet with surprising grace and padded toward her on legs that moved like liquid shadow. When it reached the edge of its nest, it spread tiny wings that were barely large enough to lift a feather and made a small, questioning sound. Sarah's rational mind was screaming warnings at her. Dragons had been the most feared predators in galactic history, creatures of such terrible power and intelligence that entire star systems had been evacuated at rumors of their presence. They were said to be telepathic, capable of reading minds and manipulating thoughts. They could breathe fire hot enough to melt battle armor, and their adult forms had been large enough to swallow starships whole. But this was a baby, and it was looking at her with what could only be described as hope. "Hello there, little one," Sarah said gently, extending her hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. The dragon's response was immediate and overwhelming. It launched itself from its nest with a joyful cry, its tiny wings beating furiously as it glided across the small space between them. It landed on her outstretched arm with surprising delicacy, its claws finding purchase in the fabric of her robe without scratching her skin. The moment the dragon touched her, Sarah's world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind, not her own memories, but something else entirely. She saw vast cities of crystal and light, beings of incredible beauty and power, soaring through skies that blazed with aurora fire. She saw laboratories filled with genetic templates and cultural archives, preservation chambers and stasis fields that could keep entire civilizations safe for millennia. And she saw the truth about the Dragon Lord's disappearance. They hadn't been conquered or killed. They had simply chosen to sleep, waiting for the right moment to return. But their sleep had lasted longer than expected, and now only one remained awake. This small, vulnerable hatchling, who had been waiting for 3,000 years for someone to find him. Someone like her. The dragon settled against her chest, its warm weight somehow comforting despite everything she knew about its species. It made soft, contented sounds as it arranged itself in the crook of her arm, and Sarah could feel its trust washing over her in waves that made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. "Why me?" she whispered, gently stroking the creature's scaled head with one finger. "Why did you choose a human?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling. The dragon showed her images of her own crash landing, her desperate fight to save her dying ship, the way she had prioritized sending a distress signal over her own safety even when she thought no one would ever hear it. He had been watching, learning, understanding something about humans that no other species in the galaxy had ever bothered to notice. Humans didn't give up. Even when facing impossible odds, even when they knew they were going to die, they kept fighting to protect others. They chose hope over despair, compassion over cruelty, and love over fear. The dragon had been alone for 3 millennia, guarding the sleeping forms of his people and waiting for someone worthy of their trust. He had watched countless species come and go, had observed wars and peace treaties and the rise and fall of entire civilizations, but never had he seen anything like the small human female who had risked her own life to send a warning to others who might follow her into danger. "You're not just a baby, are you?" Sarah asked, beginning to understand. "You're their guardian, their protector." The dragon's response was a complex mix of emotions: pride, loneliness, hope, and something that felt remarkably like love. He was indeed the guardian, chosen before his hatching to watch over the sleeping dragon lords until the time was right for their return. But he was also young and scared and tired of being alone. Sarah looked around the chamber where she lay, really seeing it for the first time. The walls were covered with murals that seemed to move and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, depicting scenes from dragon history and culture. In alcoves around the room, she could see the dim shapes of stasis pods, hundreds of them, all darkened and silent. "They're all here," she breathed. The entire Dragon Lord civilization, sleeping and waiting. The Guardian confirmed her understanding with a gentle touch of his mind to hers. They had fled to this world when the wars became too terrible, when it became clear that their very existence was driving the younger species to destructive madness born of fear and jealousy. Better to sleep and wait for a time when the galaxy might be ready for their return than to watch civilization after civilization destroy itself trying to fight them. But they had underestimated how long that sleep would need to last. Centuries had become millennia, and still the galaxy was not ready. The Guardian had begun to lose hope, to wonder if perhaps his people should sleep forever, rather than risk awakening to a universe that would never accept them. Then Sarah had arrived, a human who risked everything to warn others of danger, even enemies who had been hunting her. A human who showed kindness to a creature that every other species would kill on sight. A human whose first instinct upon seeing him had been to offer comfort rather than flee in terror. Perhaps, the Guardian thought as he curled more tightly against Sarah's warmth, the galaxy was finally ready to learn what humans had always known. That strength came not from domination, but from the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. As the twin suns began to set outside the crystal chamber, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah found herself facing a choice that would determine the fate of countless worlds. She could try to find a way off this planet, return to her own people, and report the discovery of the sleeping dragon lords to the Terran fleet. Such information would be invaluable, potentially changing the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Or she could stay and learn what the Guardian was so desperately trying to show her, hidden in the depths of genetic memory and ancient wisdom that flowed between them whenever they touched. There were secrets here, truths about the nature of consciousness and evolution, that could revolutionize everything science thought it knew about life in the universe. The Guardian watched her internal struggle with ancient eyes that held depths of understanding far beyond his apparent age. He could not force her to stay. Such compulsion would violate everything his people believed about free will and the sanctity of choice. But he could hope, and in that hope was a love so pure and desperate that it made Sarah's heart ache. "I can't leave you alone," she whispered finally, making her choice. "Not after 3,000 years. No one should be alone that long." The joy that radiated from the Guardian was like standing in sunlight after years of darkness. He pressed his small head against her hand and shared with her a gift that no other species had ever received, a true name in the ancient language of dragons. Zephyrix the Eternal, Guardian of Dreams, Keeper of Hope. And in return, Sarah gave him something equally precious, the promise that whatever happened next, he would never have to face it alone again. As the stars began to emerge in the alien sky above them, human and dragon settled in to wait for whatever dawn might bring. Neither knew that their meeting had already begun to change the course of galactic history, or that the love growing between them would soon become the catalyst for the greatest transformation the universe had ever seen. They only knew that for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them felt alone. Days blended into nights on Drakmor as Sarah learned to navigate the strange rhythms of an alien world. The twin suns never set completely at the same time, ensuring that somewhere in the crystal-carved sky there was always at least a sliver of golden light. This eternal twilight created an otherworldly beauty that Sarah found both mesmerizing and unsettling. Zephyrix had not left her side since their first meeting. The baby dragon followed her everywhere, perched on her shoulder when she explored the ancient chambers, curled in her lap when she rested, and nestled against her chest when she slept. His constant presence should have been overwhelming, but instead Sarah found herself looking forward to the gentle weight of his small form and the musical chiming sounds he made when he was content. The Guardian's touch allowed Sarah to access parts of the vast underground complex that would have remained sealed to any other species. Doors made of living crystal responded to his presence. Corridors lit themselves with soft bioluminescence when he passed, and ancient systems that had slumbered for millennia awakened at his command. On her fourth day in the complex, Zephyrix led her to what could only be described as a library, though it bore little resemblance to any human archive. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows high above, and its walls were covered with what looked like flowing rivers of liquid light. As Sarah approached one of these luminous streams, images began to form in the radiance, scenes from dragon history playing out in three-dimensional detail. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, watching as tiny figures of ancient dragons soared through miniature skies, their forms so lifelike she felt she could reach out and touch them. Zephyrix chirped approvingly and pressed one small claw against a particular section of the wall. The liquid light responded immediately, swirling and reshaping itself until Sarah found herself looking at what appeared to be a star map of the entire galaxy. But this was no ordinary chart. It showed not just the positions of stars and planets, but the flow of life itself through space and time. Threads of brilliant energy connected world to world, species to species, civilization to civilization. Some threads pulsed with healthy light, while others flickered weakly or had gone dark entirely. Sarah realized she was looking at a real-time representation of consciousness itself, a map that showed the spiritual and emotional connections between all living things.
"This is how you see the universe," Sarah said. "Understanding beginning to dawn?"
Not as separate worlds and species competing for resources, but as a single living system where everything is connected. The dragon's response filled her mind with images and emotions too complex for words. She saw the early days of dragon civilization, when the lords had first developed the ability to perceive these connections directly. They had tried to share this knowledge with younger species, believing that understanding their interconnectedness would end warfare and create lasting peace. Instead, most species had reacted with fear and suspicion. The ability to perceive the threads of consciousness seemed like mind-reading to races that valued privacy above all else. The dragon's attempts to guide and nurture other civilizations were seen as manipulation and control. Wars had broken out across the galaxy, with alliance after alliance forming for the sole purpose of destroying the Dragon Lords before they could corrupt the natural development of younger races. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she experienced the dragon's confusion and heartbreak through Zephyrix's memories. They had never sought to dominate or control. They had simply wanted to help others see the beauty of universal connection that had brought their own people such peace and wisdom. "They were afraid of you because you were different," Sarah said softly. "Because you could do things they couldn't understand." Zephyrix's mental touch carried millennia of loneliness and sorrow. The Dragon Lords had eventually realized that their very existence was preventing younger species from developing their own unique forms of consciousness and connection. Rather than continue to be seen as tyrants and manipulators, they had chosen exile. They had found this remote world, built their stasis chambers, and gone to sleep until such time as the galaxy might be ready to accept them for what they truly were. But the Guardian had remained awake, watching and waiting through the long centuries, growing more hopeless with each passing age as species after species developed the same fear-based responses to difference and power. Until Sarah had arrived. "What makes humans different?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The dragon showed her images drawn from his observation of human behavior throughout their brief galactic history. Unlike most species, humans seem to have an almost unlimited capacity for acceptance and adaptation. They formed bonds with beings so alien that other races couldn't even recognize them as alive. They adopted orphaned creatures from dozens of different worlds, fought to protect species they had never encountered before, and consistently chose cooperation over conquest when given the choice. Most remarkably, humans seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the very connections that dragons could see directly. They couldn't perceive the threads of consciousness that linked all living things, but they acted as if they could. Their legends spoke of the interconnectedness of all life. Their philosophers wrote about universal love and compassion. And their greatest heroes were invariably those who sacrificed themselves for the welfare of others. "We feel it, don't we?" Sarah realized. "We can't see the connections like you can, but we sense them somehow. That's why we're always trying to help beings we've never met before, why we keep forming alliances with species that other races consider incompatible." Zephyrix's joy at her understanding was like warm sunlight flooding through her mind. For the first time in 3,000 years, he had found someone who could grasp the truth that his people had tried so desperately to share. That all consciousness was connected, that harming others ultimately harmed oneself, and that the highest form of evolution was not the development of individual power, but the recognition of universal love. Over the following days, the Guardian began to share more of his people's knowledge with Sarah. She learned about the stasis chambers that held the sleeping Dragon Lords, each one a miracle of biotechnology that could preserve life indefinitely, while the consciousness within experienced eons of peaceful dreams. She discovered vast archives of genetic templates that could be used to restore extinct species, or even create entirely new forms of life adapted to specific environments. Most astonishing of all, she was shown the consciousness engines, massive crystalline structures that could amplify and direct the threads of connection between living beings. In the right hands, these devices could end conflict simply by allowing the warring parties to directly experience each other's emotions and perspectives. They could accelerate evolution, enhance empathy, and create bonds of understanding that transcended species boundaries. This is what your people were trying to give the galaxy. Sarah breathed as she stood before one of the towering crystal formations. Not domination or control, but the tools to truly understand each other. But with understanding came a crushing realization of the magnitude of what she had discovered. The sleeping dragon lords represented knowledge and power beyond anything the current galaxy could imagine. Their biotechnology could cure diseases that had plagued civilizations for millennia. Their consciousness techniques could end wars and create lasting peace between species that had been enemies for generations. Their very existence could reshape the balance of power in the universe. And they had chosen her, a single human scout, to be their ambassador to the modern galaxy. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah found herself pacing the crystal chambers late into the alien night, while Zephyrix watched her with patient, understanding eyes. How could she possibly convince the Galactic Council to accept the return of a species they had been taught to fear for 3,000 years? How could she make them understand that the Dragon Lords meant no harm when every piece of recorded history painted them as conquerors and tyrants? "I'm just one person," Sarah said finally, sinking down beside the Guardian's nest. "How can I possibly change 3 millennia of fear and prejudice?" Zephyrix's response came not in words or images, but in a flood of pure emotion. He showed her his own journey from doubt to hope, the long years of despair that had gradually transformed into patient faith. He had watched the galaxy evolve, had seen species learn to overcome their differences and work together in ways that would have been impossible during the Dragon Wars. The foundation for understanding was already there. It just needed someone to show others how to build upon it. And humans, he reminded her, had always been exceptional at inspiring others to reach beyond their limitations. As if to prove his point, Zephyrix began to share with Sarah memories of human actions throughout their species' brief galactic history. She saw Terran diplomats working tirelessly to create peace between warring alien races. She witnessed human scientists sharing their discoveries freely with species that had previously been enemies. She watched human soldiers lay down their lives to protect beings they had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Your people understand instinctively what mine had to learn through eons of evolution." Zephyrix's mental voice whispered in her mind. "You know that strength comes not from power over others, but from the courage to love unconditionally." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the full magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just about the return of an extinct species. It was about the next stage of galactic evolution. The Dragon Lords had the knowledge and wisdom to guide younger races toward a level of consciousness and connection that could transform the entire universe. But they needed someone to bridge the gap between their ancient wisdom and the modern galaxy's fear. They needed someone who could speak both languages, the language of power that the galaxy understood, and the language of love that the dragons embodied. "I'll do it," Sarah whispered, gathering the small dragon against her chest. "I don't know how, but I'll find a way to bring our peoples together." Zephyrix's joy was so intense that it briefly overwhelmed her senses, filling her mind with colors that had no names and harmonies that existed beyond the range of hearing. But beneath the celebration, she could sense something else. A deep sadness that confused her until she realized its source. The Guardian knew that for her to succeed in her mission, she would have to leave Drakmor eventually. She would have to return to human space, contact the Terran fleet, and begin the delicate process of preparing the galaxy for the Dragon Lord's return. And when that time came, Zephyrix would once again be alone. "No," Sarah said firmly, understanding his fear. "You're not staying here by yourself. If I'm going to convince the galaxy that dragons can be trusted, I'm going to need you with me. They need to see what I see, not a monster from ancient legends, but a being capable of love and compassion and hope." The dragon's response was complex, gratitude mixed with terror, hope tempered by the knowledge of how other species might react to his presence. For 3,000 years he had been safe in the hidden chambers of Drakmor. Leaving would mean exposing himself to a galaxy that had been taught to kill dragons on sight. "I won't let anything happen to you," Sarah promised, feeling the weight of her words even as she spoke them. "Whatever it takes, I'll protect you the way you've been protecting your people all these years." As the twin suns began their slow dance toward another dawn, Sarah and Zephyrix made their plans. They would need to find a way to contact the outside galaxy, to arrange for a ship to retrieve them from Drakmor's forbidden surface. They would need to prepare for the inevitable shock and fear that would greet their arrival in human space. Most importantly, they would need to begin documenting the incredible discoveries hidden within the Dragon Complex, evidence that would support their claims and help convince skeptics that the Dragon Lords truly meant no harm to the galaxy they had once called home. It would be dangerous beyond imagining. Sarah was quite possibly about to become the most hunted human in galactic history, and Zephyrix would be risking not only his own life, but the safety of his entire sleeping species. But as they settled in together to wait for the coming day, both human and dragon felt something they hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future. Neither of them could have predicted that their greatest challenges lay not in convincing the galaxy to accept the dragon's return, but in surviving the forces that would stop at nothing to prevent it. Ancient enemies were already stirring, alerted by the activation of long-dormant systems on the Forbidden World. And somewhere in the depths of space, ships were beginning to move toward Drakmor, with orders to ensure that whatever had awakened there would never see the light of another star. The countdown to revelation had begun, and Sarah and Zephyrix were running out of time to change the fate of both their species. The first sign that their isolation was ending came on the 7th day, when the ancient warning systems throughout the Dragon complex began to hum with energy they hadn't channeled in centuries. Sarah woke to the sound of crystalline chimes echoing through the corridors, each tone carrying an urgency that made her pulse race even before she understood its meaning. Zephyrix was already awake, his small form tense with alert attention as his head tilted towards sounds that were beyond Sarah's hearing range. When she reached out to touch him, seeking the mental connection that had become as natural as breathing, she was overwhelmed by his sudden spike of fear and protective anger. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sitting up on the bed of woven starlight that had become her sanctuary in this strange world. The dragon's response came in the form of shared sensory input. Sarah suddenly found herself perceiving Drakmor as Zephyrix did, through senses that could detect electromagnetic fluctuations and consciousness patterns from vast distances. What she experienced made her blood run cold. Ships were approaching the planet. Not just one or two vessels, but an entire fleet. She could sense their occupants through the quantum field disturbances their technology created. Minds filled with grim purpose, fear disguised as righteous determination, and an underlying hatred that felt like acid against her consciousness. "They're coming to destroy this place, aren't they?" Sarah whispered, though she already knew the answer. Through their connection, Zephyrix showed her what his enhanced perceptions had revealed. The approaching fleet belonged to the Vorthan Empire, the same species that had been hunting Sarah when she'd crashed on Drakmor. But they weren't coming for her anymore. They were coming because ancient automated sensors hidden throughout the galaxy had detected the awakening of dragon technology and had transmitted that information to every major government in known space. The Vorthans had simply been the first to respond to what their military considered the greatest threat in galactic history: the return of the Dragon Lords. Sarah felt a surge of protective fury unlike anything she had ever experienced. These beings who approached with weapons and hatred knew nothing about what they were planning to destroy. They had never seen the beauty of the consciousness maps that revealed the connections between all living things. They had never experienced the profound love and wisdom that radiated from every crystal chamber in the complex. They were prepared to commit genocide based on fear and legends that were 3,000 years out of date. "We have to wake your people," Sarah said, rising to her feet with grim determination. "If they're going to attack, the Dragon Lords need to be able to defend themselves." But Zephyrix's response was immediate and heartbroken. Through their mental link, he showed her why awakening the sleepers was impossible. The stasis process required a gradual restoration sequence that took months to complete safely. Attempting to rush the awakening would kill the very beings they were trying to protect. The Dragon Lord's consciousness had been so deeply integrated with the dream state that sudden separation would shatter their minds beyond repair. The Guardian had been specifically designed to remain conscious during the long sleep precisely because someone needed to be able to make decisions in crisis situations like this. But he was still just a hatchling, with none of the vast powers that had made adult dragons so feared throughout the galaxy. Against an entire military fleet, his abilities would be less than useless. "Then we run," Sarah said, grabbing her survival pack and checking its contents. "We get you out of here and find somewhere safe where we can plan our next move." But even as she spoke, she knew it was hopeless. The defense satellites that had nearly destroyed her ship were still active, and they would target any vessel trying to leave the planet's surface. The approaching Vorthan fleet would be monitoring every frequency, watching for any sign of escape attempts. Even if they could somehow reach orbit, where would they go? Every government in the galaxy would be mobilizing their forces to hunt down any surviving dragons. Zephyrix seemed to sense her despair, because his next mental communication was filled with gentle reassurance. and something that felt remarkably like courage. He showed her images of the Dragon Complex's deepest levels, chambers she had never seen that contained technology beyond her comprehension. There were weapons there, he revealed, not the crude, destructive devices that most species used for warfare, but tools of consciousness that could turn enemies into allies, systems that could make entire fleets forget why they had come to fight. "You're not going to try to control their minds, are you?" Sarah asked, remembering the fears that had driven the ancient dragon wars. The dragon's response was complex, layered with ethical considerations that spoke to the profound moral development of his species. The consciousness weapons were a last resort, tools that could be used to preserve life when all other options had been exhausted. They didn't destroy or dominate the minds they touched. Instead, they created temporary bridges of empathy that allowed beings to experience each other's true intentions and emotions. A Vorthan commander who experienced the genuine love and protective instinct that motivated Zephyrix would find it impossible to continue attacking. A ship's crew that felt the profound sadness of 3 millennia of loneliness would understand why the dragons had chosen exile over warfare. The weapons didn't change what people believed. They simply made it impossible to maintain hatred when confronted with the reality of what they were trying to destroy. But there was a cost. Using such power would reveal the location of the complex to every sensitive mind in the galaxy. Other species with psychic abilities would know immediately that the Dragon Lords had returned, and the period of hidden safety would end forever. Every government, every military force, every individual with a grudge against dragons would know exactly where to find them. It would mean trading temporary survival for permanent exposure. "Do it," Sarah said without hesitation. "Your people have been hiding long enough." Maybe it's time for the galaxy to see what dragons really are. As they made their way through the winding corridors toward the deep chambers, Sarah found herself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Her crash landing on Drakmor had seemed like the end of her story, a random tragedy that would be forgotten as soon as the wreckage cooled. Instead, it had become the beginning of something that could reshape the entire universe. The consciousness weapons were housed in a chamber that took her breath away. The room was vast, its walls lined with crystal formations that pulsed with internal light like captured stars. At the center of the space stood a single pedestal holding what looked like a sphere of living water, its surface reflecting images that seemed to come from every connected mind in the galaxy. The empathy engine, Zephyrix explained through their mental link. It can reach across light years to touch the consciousness of anyone within its range. But Sarah, she felt his reluctance, his fear of what using such power might mean for both their species. Once the galaxy knew that dragons could influence thoughts and emotions on such a scale, the ancient fears would seem justified. Every government would mobilize every resource to destroy what they would see as the ultimate threat to free will and self-determination. "They need to understand," Sarah said, reaching out to touch the Guardian's scaled head. "And the only way they'll understand is if they can feel what you feel, see what you see. Show them the truth, Zephyrix. Show them what dragons really are." The little dragon closed his ancient eyes and pressed his consciousness against the empathy engine. The sphere began to glow brighter, its liquid surface rippling with patterns that spoke directly to the quantum field underlying all reality. Sarah felt the moment when the weapon activated, a sensation like warm sunlight expanding outward at the speed of thought. Across the approaching fleet, Vorthan commanders suddenly found themselves experiencing memories that weren't their own. They felt 3,000 years of loneliness, the heartbreak of a species forced into exile by the fear of those they had tried to help. They experienced the profound love that had motivated every dragon action throughout history. The desperate desire to nurture and protect rather than dominate and destroy. Most overwhelming of all, they felt Zephyrix's current emotions. His terror at being discovered, his determination to protect the sleeping forms of his people, and his absolute trust in the small human female who had become the most important thing in his universe. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Ship after ship in the Vorthan fleet suddenly ceased their attack patterns, their crews overwhelmed by emotions they had never expected to feel. Communications channels that had been filled with military chatter fell silent as hardened warriors struggled to process the reality of what they had come to destroy. But not everyone was equally affected. Some minds, those trained in psychic defenses or naturally resistant to empathic influence, fought against the revelations the engine provided. These individuals became even more determined to complete their mission, convinced that what they were experiencing was proof of Dragon's dangerous ability to manipulate and control. Admiral Vex Tharian, commander of the Vorthan fleet, was one of those who resisted. His mind, honed by decades of military discipline and enhanced by cybernetic implants designed to prevent psychic intrusion, rejected the emotional bombardment with mechanical precision. All ships maintain formation. His voice crackled across the fleet communications. This is exactly what our ancestors warned us about. They're trying to subvert our will, make us sympathetic to their cause. Don't let them into your heads. About half the fleet responded to his commands, their crews managing to suppress or compartmentalize the alien emotions that had flooded their consciousness. The other half remained paralyzed by the magnitude of what they had experienced, their captains unable to reconcile orders to destroy with the profound love and wisdom they had felt from the planet below. Sarah watched the orbital displays that Zephyrix shared with her, her heart sinking as she realized that the empathy engine had not been as effective as they had hoped. The fleet was splitting apart, with some ships maintaining their attack postures, while others drifted aimlessly as their crews struggled with newfound understanding. "It's not enough," she whispered. "Half of them is still going to attack." But Zephyrix was not finished. The Guardian had one more card to play, one final revelation that he had been saving for the moment, when all other options were exhausted. Through their connection, he showed Sarah what he was about to do, and her heart nearly stopped at the magnitude of the risk he was taking. He was going to wake himself up. Not fully, that would take the same months-long process required for the adult Dragon Lords. But Zephyrix could temporarily access more of his adult consciousness and power. Enough to project his true self across space, for every mind in the fleet to perceive directly. The cost would be enormous. Such an effort would drain his life force significantly, potentially aging him centuries and minutes. If he pushed too hard, he could die from the strain, leaving his people truly defenseless. "No," Sarah said, grabbing the small dragon and pulling him against her chest. "There has to be another way. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for people who might kill us anyway." But Zephyrix's determination was absolute. Through their mental link, he shared with her the true depth of his love, not just for his own people, but for all conscious beings throughout the galaxy. He had watched civilizations rise and fall for 3 millennia, had seen wars that consumed entire star systems and peace treaties that lasted for centuries. He understood better than anyone that this moment would determine the course of galactic history for eons to come. If the dragons were destroyed now, the galaxy would lose forever the knowledge and wisdom that could guide it toward true unity and understanding. If they survived and were rejected again, they would have no choice but to sleep for another 3,000 years, waiting for a time that might never come. But if this small act of sacrifice could bridge the gap between species, if it could show the galaxy that dragons were not conquerors but protectors, then every life in the universe might benefit from the wisdom his people had gained during their long exile. "You don't understand," Zephyrix's mental voice whispered with ancient sadness. "This isn't about survival anymore. It's about whether consciousness itself will evolve beyond fear and hatred. I am the Guardian. This is what I was made for." Before Sarah could stop him, the little dragon pressed his consciousness fully against the empathy engine. The sphere blazed with light that seemed to come from the heart of creation itself, and Sarah felt Zephyrix's life force pouring out like water from a broken dam. Across space, every mind in the Vorthan fleet was suddenly flooded with a presence so vast and ancient that it dwarfed their individual consciousness like candles before a star. They experienced not just memories or emotions, but the totality of dragon existence. The weight of eons, the loneliness of exile, the love that transcended species boundaries, and the desperate hope that someday the universe might be ready for the gifts they had to offer. Even Admiral Tharion's enhanced defenses crumbled before the sheer magnitude of what he was experiencing. For the first time in his life, he felt the connections that linked all living things, saw the threads of consciousness that bound every being in an invisible web of mutual dependence and love. The effect on the fleet was instantaneous and complete. Weapons powered down, attack formations dissolved, and across dozens of ships, hardened military personnel wept openly as they experienced the profound beauty of universal connection. But the cost was exactly what Sarah had feared. In her arms, Zephyrix's small form was growing cold and still, his life force nearly depleted by the enormous effort required to project his consciousness across such vast distances. His scales had lost their lustrous sheen, and his breathing was so shallow that she had to concentrate to detect it at all. "No, no, no," Sarah whispered, cradling the dying dragon against her chest. "You can't leave me now." Not when we're so close to changing everything. Through their fading connection, she could feel Zephyrix's peace and contentment. He had done what he was created to do. He had protected his people and shown the galaxy a glimpse of what dragons truly represented. Whether he survived or not, The bridge between species had been built. The rest was up to others to maintain and strengthen. "You're going to live," Sarah said fiercely, pouring every ounce of her own life force into their connection in a desperate attempt to sustain him. "We still have work to do together. The galaxy still needs both of us." As consciousness faded from the Guardian's ancient eyes, Sarah made a decision that would echo through history. She pressed her lips to the dragon's scaled forehead and whispered a promise that seemed to resonate through the quantum field itself. "I will not let your sacrifice be meaningless. No matter what it takes, I will make sure the galaxy remembers this moment. I will make sure they understand what you've given them." In the orbital display, she could see the Vorthan fleet beginning to form protective formations around Drakmor rather than attack patterns. The empathy engine's effects were spreading, touching minds throughout the galaxy as the revelation of Dragon's survival propagated through quantum consciousness networks that most species didn't even know existed. The Dragon Lords were no longer secret. For better or worse, the galaxy now knew they had returned. And in the crystal chambers deep beneath Drakmor's surface, a human woman held a dying dragon and swore an oath that would reshape the destiny of every living being in the universe. The first delegation arrived 3 weeks after Zephyrix's sacrifice, and Sarah was amazed to discover that it wasn't a military force or a scientific expedition. Instead, a single small craft touched down on Drakmor's crystalline surface, carrying Admiral Vex Therian himself, the same Vorthan commander who had come to destroy the Dragon Complex and instead found his entire understanding of reality transformed. Sarah watched his approach through the crystal viewing walls of the medical chamber where Zephyrix lay in deep healing stasis. The Guardian had survived his ordeal, but just barely. Ancient dragon biotechnology was slowly repairing the damage caused by his massive expenditure of life force, but the process would take months to complete. During that time, he remained unconscious, his small form surrounded by a cocoon of healing light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Therian moved across the alien landscape with the careful respect of someone who had experienced a profound spiritual awakening. When he reached the entrance to the complex, he stopped and removed his helmet, breathing the thin atmosphere of Drakmor directly into his lungs despite the risk to his physiology. "Commander Chen." His voice came through the translation systems as Sarah met him at the main entrance. "I come seeking forgiveness, I suppose, and understanding." Sarah studied the alien being before her. Vorthans were typically a proud, militaristic species, with their scaled hide and 4 arms giving them a naturally intimidating appearance. But there was something different about Tharian now, a humility and openness in his bearing that spoke to the magnitude of his transformation. "What I experienced during the event," Tharian continued, struggling to find words for something beyond normal comprehension. "The connections I felt, the emotions that weren't my own. Is that how dragons see the universe all the time?"
"Yes," Sarah replied simply.
"And it's how they've always seen it. The Dragon Wars happened because your ancestors couldn't understand that what you interpreted as mind control was actually empathy. They were trying to share their perspective, not dominate your thoughts." Therian's 4 arms gestured in complex patterns that Sarah's translation software indicated were expressions of deep shame and regret. 3,000 years of exile because we were too afraid to understand. How many lives could have been saved if we had simply listened? They walked together through the crystal corridors, Sarah serving as both guide and guardian of the sleeping complex. She had spent the weeks since Zephyrix's collapse learning to interface with the dragon technology, guided by instructions he had shared with her during their brief conscious moments together. The complex had accepted her as the Guardian's chosen representative, granting her access to knowledge and systems that had remained hidden for millennia. "The consciousness map showed me something," Therian said as they paused before one of the flowing light displays that depicted the connections between different worlds. "My own species. We're dying, aren't we? Not physically, but spiritually. We've become so focused on military strength and territorial expansion that we've lost touch with what makes life worth living." Sarah touched the wall, and the display shifted to show the Vorthan Empire's position within the galactic web of consciousness, where healthy civilizations glowed with warm, steady light. The Vorthan worlds pulsed with the cold flickers of a culture increasingly disconnected from empathy and compassion. "It's not just your people," Sarah said gently. "Most of the galaxy is struggling with the same problems. Technology has advanced faster than wisdom. Power has grown without understanding. That's why the Dragon Lords went to sleep. They recognized that forced awakening to universal consciousness would only breed more fear and resistance." "But voluntary awakening," Tharian said, his understanding growing. "If beings choose to open themselves to connection, to see through dragon eyes willingly, Then the change is permanent and meaningful, Sarah confirmed. That's what Zephyrix was trying to show your fleet. Not that dragons could control your minds, but that connection and understanding were choices you could make for yourselves. As they continued their tour, Sarah found herself serving as an interpreter between two completely different ways of understanding reality. Through Therian's questions, she began to grasp the magnitude of the challenge facing both species. The galaxy had spent 3 millennia developing civilizations based on the assumption that consciousness was individual and isolated. Economics, politics, warfare, even art and philosophy, everything had been built on the foundation of separation rather than connection. The return of the Dragon Lords offered an alternative path, but one that would require fundamental changes in how every species understood itself and its place in the universe. It wasn't enough to simply announce that dragons were benevolent rather than threatening. The entire structure of galactic civilization would need to evolve to accommodate a consciousness-based rather than power-based model of existence. "How many of your people are there?" Tharian asked as they entered the vast chamber containing the stasis pods. Hundreds of crystalline containers lined the walls, each one containing a sleeping dragon lord whose dreams had spanned centuries. "Approximately 3,000 individuals," Sarah replied. "The entire surviving population of their species. They represent not just biological diversity, but the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of the most advanced consciousness-based civilization in galactic history." Tharian moved among the stasis pods with obvious reverence, occasionally stopping to study the peaceful faces visible through the crystal walls. "And they've been sleeping here, unprotected, for 3 millennia? Any government with sufficient firepower could have destroyed them at any time. They chose vulnerability over violence," Sarah said. "It was the ultimate expression of their philosophy. They would rather risk extinction than maintain their existence through the use of force." The Admiral's reaction was profound and immediate. His forearms pressed against his chest in what Sarah recognized as the Vorthan gesture of deep respect. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "In my culture, such a choice would be considered the highest form of honor," he said, "to willingly accept death rather than compromise one's principles. We have legends of heroes who made such sacrifices, but I never believed an entire species could embody such courage." They spent hours in the archives, with Sarah sharing the knowledge that Zephyrix had made accessible to her. Tharian observed the consciousness maps, studied the genetic templates that could restore extinct species, and marveled at the biotechnology that could heal rather than harm. With each revelation, his understanding deepened, and his commitment to what he began calling the awakening grew stronger. "I must return to my government," he finally said, as their time together drew to a close. "But not to report on a threat that needs to be contained. I need to prepare my people for the most important choice in our history, whether to remain isolated and diminishing, or to open ourselves to connection and growth." But even as he spoke, Sarah could sense his uncertainty. Governments that had spent centuries building power structures based on fear and separation would not easily accept the fundamental changes that dragon consciousness offered. Some would resist out of genuine concern for their people's safety. Others would fight to maintain the systems that kept them in positions of authority. "There will be opposition," Sarah said, voicing what they both knew to be true. "Fierce opposition," Tharian agreed. "There are species in this galaxy that have built their entire identities around the fear of dragon domination. The hegemony of pure thought has made their hatred of psychic beings the cornerstone of their civilization. The machine collective considers any form of consciousness-based technology to be a corruption of proper artificial intelligence. Even within my own empire, there are factions that will see your guardian's demonstration of empathic connection as proof that dragons must be destroyed." Sarah felt a chill of foreboding. She had been so focused on the immediate threat to Drakmor that she hadn't fully considered the longer-term implications of the galaxy, knowing about the Dragon Lord's survival. Zephyrix's sacrifice had saved his people from immediate destruction, but it had also painted a target on every dragon in the universe. "We need allies," she realized. "Species that are already open to consciousness-based philosophy. Governments that prioritize cooperation over conquest." "The Terran Federation," Tharian suggested immediately. "Your own people have always been unusually accepting of alien consciousness. If humans publicly supported the Dragon Lord's return, it would mean everything," Sarah agreed. But even as she spoke, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Humanity was still a relatively young species in galactic politics, and their influence was limited by both their small territorial holdings and their reputation for emotional decision-making. Convincing Earth's government to risk their position by allying with the most feared beings in galactic history would require evidence and arguments that went far beyond appeals to compassion and understanding. Over the following days, as more delegations arrived from across the galaxy, Sarah began to understand the true complexity of what lay ahead. Some visitors came in peace, like Tharian, genuinely seeking to understand what dragons offered the galaxy. Others arrived with hidden agendas, looking for weaknesses they could exploit or technologies they could steal. Most challenging of all were those who came with fear disguised as scientific curiosity. They asked probing questions about dragon abilities, mapped the complex's defenses, and requested detailed information about the stasis process that kept the Dragon Lords asleep. Sarah recognized the signs of intelligence gathering when she saw it, and she became increasingly careful about what she revealed to whom. The pressure was enormous, and Sarah found herself longing for Zephyric's guidance. The Guardian's knowledge of galactic politics and cultural psychology was irreplaceable, but he remained unconscious in his healing cocoon, his recovery progressing with agonizing slowness. It was during one of her lonely vigils beside his stasis chamber that Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden within the complex's deepest archives was a collection of files that Zephyrix had not shown her, records that painted a very different picture of the ancient dragon wars than what galactic history books taught. According to these documents, the Dragon Lords had not simply chosen exile when faced with galactic opposition. They had been betrayed by allies they had trusted, species that had initially welcomed dragon guidance but had then turned against them when offered power and territory by those who feared dragon influence. The betrayal had been orchestrated by a secret coalition of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, united by their shared fear of losing control over their own populations. They had deliberately spread misinformation about dragon intentions, funded research into anti-psychic technologies, and coordinated the military campaigns that had driven the Dragon Lords from world after world. Most shocking of all, the coalition still existed. Operating in secret for 3,000 years, they had shaped galactic politics from the shadows, ensuring that consciousness-based technologies never developed beyond primitive levels and that species capable of empathic connection remained marginalized and powerless. The files included current membership lists, communication protocols, and detailed plans for responding to exactly what was happening now: the return of the Dragon Lords to active galactic society. Sarah stared at the evidence displayed on crystal screens throughout the archive chamber, her heart sinking as she realized the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't just about overcoming 3 millennia of fear and prejudice. They were up against an organized conspiracy that had been preparing for this moment for longer than most civilizations had existed. "They're going to try to destroy us," she whispered to the unconscious form of her draconic companion. "And they have resources and allies we can't even imagine." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt a spark of the same determination that had kept Zephyrix vigilant for 3,000 years. The Dragon Complex contained more than just sleeping beings and ancient wisdom. It held the tools necessary to expose the conspiracy that had shaped galactic politics for millennia. If the galaxy was going to wake up to the reality of universal connection, it would need to understand how it had been kept asleep for so long. And Sarah Chen, one human woman with a dying dragon's trust, was going to make sure that understanding came to light. The real battle for the soul of galactic civilization was about to begin, and for the first time since arriving on Drakmor, Sarah felt ready to fight it. Around her, the crystal chambers hummed with anticipation, as if the complex itself was preparing for what was to come. In his healing cocoon, Zephyrix's heartbeat grew slightly stronger, as though even in unconsciousness, he could sense that the greatest test of both their species was approaching. The dragons had chosen to sleep rather than fight for 3,000 years. But their guardian was awake now, and she had no intention of letting her people face the coming storm alone. 6 months after the first delegation's arrival on Drakmor, the galactic community was divided as it had never been before in recorded history. The revelation of the Dragon Lord's survival had shattered 3 millennia of assumed reality, creating rifts between species that had been allies for generations and forging new alliances among beings who had never before found common ground. Sarah stood before the Galactic Council, in the Great Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime, the neutral world where representatives from every major civilization gathered to debate issues affecting the entire galaxy. Behind her, displayed on massive holographic screens, evidence of the Shadow Coalition's 3,000-year conspiracy played out in documented detail. Communication records, financial transfers, technological suppressions, and assassination orders, all the proof needed to demonstrate how the galaxy's most powerful governments had systematically prevented the development of consciousness-based civilization. But it was the small figure beside her that commanded the most attention from the thousands of assembled delegates. Zephyrix had awakened from his healing stasis just 2 weeks earlier, and though he was still weak from his sacrifice, he had insisted on accompanying Sarah to what they both knew would be the most important political gathering in galactic history. The Guardian was no longer the tiny hatchling who had first bonded with Sarah. His brush with death, and the massive expenditure of life force, had triggered a partial maturation process that had left him roughly the size of a large dog, with scales that shimmered between deep blue and silver, depending on the angle of observation. His eyes retained their ancient wisdom, but there was a new depth to them now, the weight of fully understanding what his survival meant for both his species and the galaxy at large. "Honorable delegates," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite her human vocal cords not being designed for such acoustics. "For 3,000 years, your civilizations have lived with the fear that somewhere in the darkness between stars, dragons were plotting your destruction. Today, I stand before you to reveal the truth, that the only beings plotting destruction were those who claimed to protect you from it." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Representatives from the Shadow Coalition member species rose to their feet in outrage, their translation systems filling the air with denials and accusations. The delegate from the hegemony of pure thought, a crystalline being whose every facet glowed with indignation, projected its thoughts directly into the assembly hall's consciousness field. "These are fabrications created by dragon mind control." Its voice echoed in the minds of every delegate present. The very fact that this human can communicate with the creature beside her proves that she has been psychically compromised. Her testimony is worthless. But Zephyrix was ready for such accusations. With Sarah's permission, he had spent the weeks of preparation carefully documenting every piece of evidence in ways that could be verified by independent analysis. Neural pattern scanners confirmed that Sarah's brain showed no signs of external manipulation. Quantum forensic analysis verified the authenticity of the Coalition documents. Most convincingly, consciousness mapping technology developed by species that had never had contact with dragons confirmed that the empathic connections the Guardian demonstrated were voluntary on both sides. "The evidence speaks for itself," Admiral Therian declared, rising from his position among the Vorthan delegation. "My government has conducted extensive analysis of the materials provided by Commander Chen and the Guardian. The Shadow Coalition's interference in galactic development can be traced through historical records, economic patterns, and technological gaps that have no other logical explanation." His words carried tremendous weight. The Vorthan Empire's conversion from dragon hunters to dragon allies had been one of the most dramatic political reversals in recent history, and their support lent credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as propaganda. More allies spoke up as the debate continued. The Empathic Collective, a confederation of psychically sensitive species that had been marginalized for millennia, presented evidence of systematic discrimination and technological suppression. The Terran Federation's representative revealed classified files documenting attempts by unknown parties to sabotage human research into consciousness-based technologies. Even the Machine Collective, traditionally opposed to any form of biological consciousness, admitted that their own development had been mysteriously guided away from areas that might have led to understanding of quantum awareness fields. But the Shadow Coalition had not remained idle during the months since Drakmor's awakening. As Sarah presented each piece of evidence, their representatives countered with their own materials. Carefully crafted propaganda that painted the Dragon Lords as master manipulators who were using advanced psychological techniques to turn the galaxy against its own protectors. "Look at what has already happened," the hegemon delegate projected, its crystalline form flashing with patterns of accusation. "Species that have maintained peaceful relations for centuries are now at each other's throats over dragon philosophy. Governments are falling as populations demand impossible changes to economic and social structures. The galaxy is being torn apart by consciousness that claims to promote unity." It was a compelling argument, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into the faces of delegates who had seemed sympathetic moments before. The Shadow Coalition was using the very chaos their own exposure had created as evidence that dragon influence was destructive to galactic stability. That was when Zephyrix decided to speak for himself. The Guardian had remained silent throughout the proceedings, respecting the political protocols that governed interspecies dialogue. But as doubt spread through the assembly like a contagion, he rose to his feet and extended his consciousness outward, not to control or manipulate, but to offer a gift of understanding to anyone willing to accept it. "I am Zephyrix the Eternal," his mental voice reached every mind in the chamber. carrying with it the weight of 3,000 years of solitude and hope. Guardian of dreams, keeper of hope, and the last wakeful representative of a people who chose exile rather than conquest, I offer you not control, but choice. Experience for yourselves what dragons truly are. All remain in the darkness of fear and separation. The decision is yours alone. The offer hung in the psychic atmosphere of the chamber like a challenge and an invitation combined. Unlike his desperate projection during the Vorthan attack, this was careful and controlled, a doorway that each individual could choose to walk through or ignore. One by one, delegates began to accept the connection. Not all. Many species representatives were protected by psychic shields or were simply too afraid to lower their mental defenses. But enough accepted the offered link that the chamber itself seemed to fill with a new quality of light and understanding. Through Zephyrix's memories, they experienced the true history of the Dragon Wars, not the simplified narrative of good versus evil that had been taught for millennia, but the complex tragedy of species that had simply been too different to understand each other. They felt the agonizing decision to choose exile over forced coexistence, the long centuries of loneliness as the Guardian maintained his vigil, and the desperate hope that someday the galaxy might evolve beyond its need for enemies and protectors. Most powerfully, they experienced Sarah's arrival and the bridge of understanding that had formed between human and dragon consciousness. Through Zephyrix's perception, they felt the moment when Sarah had chosen to stay rather than flee. Her decision to risk everything to protect a being she had every reason to fear. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Delegates who had entered the chamber as sworn enemies of dragonkind found themselves weeping openly as they experienced the profound love and protective instinct that motivated every dragon action. The Shadow Coalition's carefully constructed arguments crumbled in the face of direct emotional truth. But it was what happened next that truly changed the course of galactic history. Sarah, feeling the connections forming between Zephyrix and the assembled delegates, made a choice that she had been contemplating for months. She opened her own mind fully, sharing not just her memories of time on Drakmor, but her deepest understanding of what the dragon-human bond represented. Through her consciousness, the delegates experienced something unprecedented. The perspective of a species that had evolved empathy without needing to see the connections between living beings directly. They felt humanity's instinctive understanding that strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. The fierce loyalty that could bridge any gap of species or philosophy, and the stubborn hope that had always driven humans to reach for seemingly impossible dreams. Most importantly, they experienced the moment when Sarah had held a dying dragon in her arms and sworn to make his sacrifice meaningful. They felt the depth of her commitment to both species, her willingness to risk everything to prevent another 3,000 years of separation and fear. The combined emotional truth of dragon wisdom and human determination proved impossible to resist or deny. Even delegates who had entered the chamber as confirmed opponents found their certainty cracking in the face of such profound sincerity and love. When the connections finally faded, the great assembly hall was silent except for the soft sounds of beings across dozens of species struggling to process what they had experienced. Many were weeping, others sat in stunned contemplation, and a few appeared to be having profound spiritual experiences that transcended normal categories of thought and emotion. The Shadow Coalition delegates were among the most affected. Without their psychic shields and propaganda to protect them, they had experienced the full truth of their own actions across the centuries. The weight of 3 millennia of unnecessary suffering. The civilizations that had stagnated because consciousness-based development had been suppressed. The conflicts that had been artificially prolonged to prevent unity and understanding. All of it crashed down on them with devastating clarity. "We were wrong," the hegemon delegate whispered, its crystalline form now flickering with patterns of shame and regret rather than defiance. "We were so afraid of losing control that we became the very monsters we claimed to be fighting against." Similar admissions came from around the chamber, as the conspiracy's members faced the reality of what their fear had cost the galaxy. Some broke down entirely, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their mistakes. Others began immediately working to calculate what reparations might be possible for the damage they had caused. But it was the broader transformation among the delegates that gave Sarah and Zephyrix real hope for the future. Species that had never before shown interest in consciousness-based philosophy were asking detailed questions about empathic connection techniques. Governments that had historically opposed psychic development were offering to fund research into quantum awareness fields. Military leaders who had built their careers on the assumption that strength came from superior firepower were discussing the strategic advantages of armies that could truly understand their enemies' perspectives. The debate that followed lasted for weeks, as the assembled delegates worked to hammer out the framework for what they were calling the New Galactic Compact. Unlike previous agreements between species, this would be based not on territorial boundaries or resource allocation, but on shared commitment to consciousness development and empathic understanding. The Dragon Lords would be welcomed back into galactic society, but not as rulers or teachers. Instead, they would serve as guides and advisors, helping other species develop their own unique approaches to consciousness expansion. In return, they would be protected by a coalition of worlds committed to ensuring that no species would ever again face extinction because of what made them different. Most importantly, the compact established the principle that consciousness development was a fundamental right of all sentient beings. No government could suppress research into empathic technologies, no military could use anti-psychic weapons against civilian populations, and no species could be marginalized or persecuted because of their natural psychic abilities. On the day the new Galactic Compact was signed, Sarah stood with Zephyrix on a balcony overlooking Nexus Prime's capital city. Below them, beings from hundreds of species celebrated in ways that would have been impossible just months earlier. Vorthan warriors shared meditation techniques with empathic collective philosophers. Human engineers worked with dragon consciousness specialists to develop technologies that enhanced, rather than suppressed, natural psychic abilities. Even machine collective artificial intelligences were exploring ways to incorporate empathic subroutines into their base programming. "Do you think it will last?" Sarah asked, watching a group of children from a dozen different species play together in the plaza below. They were using simple empathic connection techniques that Zephyrix had taught them, sharing emotions and perspectives across species boundaries as naturally as breathing. The Guardian considered the question with the weight of his long experience. "Nothing lasts forever," he said finally. "But this is different from what came before. We're not trying to impose unity from the outside. We're helping each species discover its own capacity for connection. That kind of change comes from within, and it's much harder to undo." He was right, Sarah realized. The transformation she had witnessed over the past months hadn't been about dragons convincing other species to adopt their philosophy. Instead, it had been about beings across the galaxy discovering aspects of consciousness they had never known they possessed. The connections forming between worlds were being built with willing hands and open hearts, not through manipulation or coercion. "Your people can wake up now," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "The galaxy is finally ready for them." Zephyrix's response was pure joy, a wordless song of triumph and relief that had been 3 millennia in the making. The Guardian's vigil was finally over. His people could return to active life in a universe that no longer saw them as threats to be destroyed, but as partners in the greatest adventure any species could undertake, the conscious evolution of awareness itself. As they prepared to return to Drakmor to begin the awakening process, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple crash landing, a random encounter between a lost human and a lonely dragon. But from that small beginning had grown a friendship that bridged species boundaries, a love that overcame millennia of fear, and a hope that had literally reshaped the destiny of every living being in the galaxy. "You know," Sarah said as their transport prepared for the journey back to the Dragon World, "when this all started, I thought you wouldn't let me go because you needed protection. But that wasn't it at all, was it?" Zephyrix's ancient eyes sparkled with affection, and something that might have been amusement. "You were never my prisoner, Sarah Chen. You were my salvation. And I think I was yours too." She knew he was right. Before crashing on Drakmor, she had been a good soldier following orders, doing her job without questioning the larger system she served. Now she was something unprecedented in galactic history. A bridge between species, a living symbol of what became possible when beings chose connection over separation. As their ship entered hyperspace, carrying them toward a world where 3,000 Dragon Lords were about to wake up to a galaxy transformed by love, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The scared, lonely woman who had crashed on a forbidden world was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the most important lesson the universe had to offer. Strength didn't come from standing alone against the darkness.